All right, good afternoon, everyone. So, I will be presenting on this topic, heat and drought stress. Um, b- uh, Before I start, when was the severe last drought? It's a very simple question that we observed. Couple of years ago, 2000.
Right now.
Yep, thanks. So 2022, it started in 2021. Um, how many of you guys remember small spurts of droughts and heats? Can anybody remember any of those? So what? Every year, yes. We usually remember the ones which are big and longer. We don't pay much attention. Some do, some don't. To the ones which happen suddenly, they're short duration, but they are getting more and more frequent. Um, we in 2022, when the drought happened, I was getting phone calls to write letters for producers that, hey, I am watering my crop, but it's still dying. And my leaves are getting very warm. And what should I do? So I was also noticing some of these things that these are irrigated crops. We are in a drought. Should I call a crop that is under irrigation is under drought? Because it's true for a crop that is rain fed, but if I am irrigating it, is it truly be under drought or not? So I was started getting into these questions, and so even though these guys were irrigating, some of them were some of them were getting like 240 bushels, and some of them were getting into 94 bushels of corn. Something was happening. That was a little bit missing. And then I started looking at my own data that there are years when I see response to irrigation despite having normal rainfall. And then there are years that I do not get a response on irrigation with the same normal rainfall for the season. So started digging more into it. This presentation is more on the observations that I had from my own data. Kind of makes me a little bit nervous because I do not have the studies I'm going to present were not designed for heat and drought stress components, but we were able to see those things in the field. So, oh, do you have a clicker, or I'll just tell you. Just
Oh, it's over
oh,
there.
there. You can see it. Yeah. So, just starting with the basic, what is a drought? When you cannot meet your crop's water demand, you are in a drought, right? It's as simple as that. Heat, when your surroundings are getting hot and it's making your crop's canopy hotter than the surrounding air, you are stressing your crop with heat. Both these stresses can occur independently. So you can have hot air but good amount of water, and you can have a drought in a winter. So both stresses plants are going to respond to physiologically, morphologically, genetically. And both stresses can occur simultaneously as well, which we have seen. I will start with a little bit on transpiration. So I will just go a little bit on the basics first as we move to this presentation. Um, so what is transpiration? It is the water molecules getting into the plant's roots, moving through the plant's body, escaping from the stomata on the leaves. Every single drop that is leaving the plant's leaf is taking some energy with it. That's heat energy. And that's how it cools down the plant's canopy. And we call it transpiration. What drives it? It's the vapor pressure deficit. What is vapor pressure deficit? How dry your soil is. So, and how does that work? This little chart over here, the temperature is going this way up to 95, and relative humidity is decreasing this way. You have less relative humidity at high temperature, your vapor pressure deficit is very high. And the deficit is in the stomata, that vapor pressure is almost saturated. But in the air, it is less than that. And it essentially is a process of diffusion. And the more gradient we have, more transpiration we can expect. And hotter the air and lower the relative humidity, more transpiration that's going to happen. Transpiration overall will be influenced by air temperature, how windy you are, what kind of moisture you have in your soil, how big is your canopy, and of course the vapor pressure deficit. What does it do? So when the water moves into a plant body, it just does not cool the plant's canopy. It actually helps with photosynthesis. Leaves have these guard cells. They're filled with water, and when they're filled with water, once the sunlight comes on it, the stomata opens. That's the exchange site where carbon dioxide gets into the plant body and starts getting involved in photosynthesis, and water moves out through there. But when there is drought, plant actually reduces the amount of water that's getting into its body. Water gets out of these guard cells, stomata closes. When stomata closes, photosynthesis stops. Plants usually adapt. We all have seen it. Broadleaves usually droop. Grasses curl and straight up. They're trying to minimize the sunlight penetrating the leaf surface to stop transpiration as much as they can. Heat. In ideal moisture conditions, the more heat you generate in surrounding the plant, the more transpiration it's going to do. Why? Because it wants to sweat and cool its canopy. It will do it up to a certain point before heat is going to start breaking it internally. It will have biochemical, physiological, and genetic disruptions. Usually it's heat shock proteins plants will produce. Cell membranes usually break, and it will also damage chloroplasts. So both heat and drought disrupt photosynthesis, but plants have two mechanisms to fix heat. So drought has plants have heat acts differently on two different kind of plants, C3 and C4. C3 plants are the ones like wheat, you have broadleaves like soybean and stuff like that. When carbon dioxide is getting into plant system stomata, it directly goes into that photosynthesis site, attaches to ribisco, which is a protein that converts it into helps it converting into first 3 carbon compound of photosynthesis. They're called C3 plants. In C4 plants, which are mostly grasses, and these guys originated around more hot areas in the world, before it gets to photosynthetic site, it will get into that Kranz anatomy, I think it's called. Before carbon dioxide gets into photosynthesis site, it's going to get into that PEP molecule. It will become a 4 carbon molecule, and that is going to get out into photosynthesis cycle where it's going to disintegrate into carbon dioxide. What I'm trying to say is there is a barrier in C4 plants before the carbon dioxide gets into photosynthesis site. What does that do? Rubisco has affinity for both carbon dioxide and oxygen. If you increase the temperature or heat a little bit, then rubisco is going to start binding with the oxygen, and that will start photorespiration. And that actually is not good because it will reduce the photosynthetic accumulation. Plants will stunt, they will eventually will die. Uh, just basic, I thought I will do. But what happens when you combine these stresses? This guy in 2006 wrote a opinion. It was not an article, it was an opinion in Trends in Plant Sciences. Before then, people were studying heat stress and drought stress individually, and he said there is something going on that we need to study these stresses together. So he put together this graph and he said, all right, there is a control. And then when you put heat stress to it, your photosynthesis declines a little bit. Stomatal conductance goes up because your stomata is opening to transpire more to keep the leaf cool. And then respiration also goes up, and leaf temperature obviously is going to go up. But when it comes to drought, photosynthesis plummets. Respiration is almost similar, and then leaf temperature is almost similar. But there is no stomatal conductance because the stomata closed. When you put drought and heat together, it becomes adverse. So when you put drought and heat together, the impact is worse. And if anybody wants to visualize, this is this soybean leaf. They did this experiment. This is controlled. They put it under drought, and then they put it under heat. The plant started transpiring. It cooled off, but in both drought and heat, it was warm. It got cooked. This is gene expressions. And this guy also put this thing together. And he said, all right, the genetic response of plants to drought, heat, and drought and heat are different. Only 77 of those gene expression which were responding were transcriptomes. I don't know exactly what they are, but overall he said that every response to each plant's response to each stress is unique. So drought, one response. Heat, one response. You put drought and heat, there is a different response. That's what he was trying to say. So both for transcripts and metabolites. Which one is worse if somebody is asking drought or heat if we are just looking individually? I found this data over here. C is control and then drought, drought and heat and heat. This is relative water content in the leaf. The leaf was driest in the drought and heat. And when you compare heat and drought, it was driest in the drought. What about electrolyte leakage? Drought overall, the electrolyte leakage tells me how much membrane broke and the electrolytes came out of plant cell. Drought again won the race. So drought and heat, of course, is bad, but when you compare just heat and drought, drought is always going to be bad. I started getting into cotton, not cotton, I mean the crops, trying to find anybody who has done any work on these things. And I found from 2013 onwards, people were working on these things in controlled environments. This guy worked on cotton. He had control, he had drought stress, heat stress, and drought and heat stress for stomatal conductance, transpiration, leaf temperature. It doesn't matter, all of them declined or reduced. Drought and heat stress was the worst. Leaf temperature, it raised, and then it was highest for the drought and heat stress. So this is one crop. What they did, I should have said it earlier. They just, for the drought stress, they did 32 degrees Celsius at 45% moisture that the plant required, and then 38 for heat stress, 100% moisture, and drought heat stress. It should be 38 over here, and then half the water the crop needed. For boll number and seed count, overall, you reduce your yield. The cotton plant yield or the boll number usually comes down with drought heat stress. And seed oil is also lower, but the lowest was drought stress. Soybean, I found this data. This is control, water stress, heat stress, and water plus heat stress. And total number of seeds and yield per plant, they all plummeted. Water stress, there was something funny over here that I saw. No, it was in a paper that I read. Um, there was that they said that the more heat stress you have, there was soybean was having more oil content in their seed. I have not presented the data. I just read it this morning. I work with corn. All these studies that I presented were conducted in control environment. So I saw in field some observation, but I did not have data, and I wanted to relate it to what I was observing. So I found this manuscript, and they did review of corn production under different temperatures in Asia, subtropics, in United States, in Europe, in these all these regions, and they found out it's usually around 96 to 104 degree Fahrenheit is the critical limit for the temperature, and for at different growth stages. I picked 95 degree Fahrenheit for my data. So I'm just presenting it to explain what I have done in the next slides. So I picked the lowest number, 95 degree Fahrenheit as threshold. And I started looking at my data. I will show the data first, and then I will show what we observed. So you have yield here in bushels per acre, and this is 800 gallons per minute, 600, 450, 600. The D means this was in subsurface drip irrigation, and this thing was applied water every day. These were getting water every fourth day. So that also was as daily irrigation water. 2017, I was able to see some response in my irrigation treatments. I did not see any response in 2018. And if you average all these, 2017 was 20 bushels lower than the average yield in 2018. When I looked at it, this is rain over here in 17 and 18. Both years got from April to September, the growing seasons, about same amount of rainfall, way more than what we expect normally in Goodwill, Oklahoma. We usually expect 10 inches in these during this time. We were having about 17 inches both years. But look at here, the green is June and then blue is July. Both of these squeezed, didn't receive much rain during this time. But what about the days which were 95 degree plus? I had the maximum days in June and July itself. So it was coinciding with the drought. This year itself, and then in 2018, I had very good number of, not, I should not say very good, I had high number of 95 plus days, but I also was coupled with some good amount of rainfall. Rainfall in Goodwill, Oklahoma is, we are irrigating, but that rain, we do need that rainfall. Why? Because rainfall supplements our irrigation. We are not in Nebraska where irrigation supplements our rainfall. So that's why it becomes very important. This year over here, we were abnormally dry year. 94% of that county was. If anybody is thinking about ET, we were actually pretty close on ET requirement of that crop. And still I was having 20 bushel difference in the yield in those 2 years. And only 1 year showed me the difference, a significant difference. This was in EVA. We did this study in 2018, 19, and 20 on corn, yields in bushels per acre. Three well capacities, 450, 600, and 710 gallons per minute. Didn't see any response in 18. Didn't see any response in 20, but we saw response in 19. How many of you guys live around Stillwater? What happened in 2019, early season? We did. So did Panhandle. Throughout the state, we had really good rainfall early in the season. But what happened later? And that's the only season I have got irrigation response and the lowest yields. So what happened over here, and by now that you guys may have guessed it already, I'm showing the same thing, same trends. 18, very well distributed rainfall. 19 and 20, I am having about normal rainfalls. right? And July and August, which is also, so July and August is when our corn is getting into the reproductive and grain filling stages. We were actually below normal. This rainfall over here up to 10 inches, we received by first week of July. July 30th, the drought monitor was saying that 100% of the county is out of drought. There was no drought at all. This is July 30th. 7 days later, they put us in drought category. You can see it on your phones. Before they updated it on their website, we were already feeling the heat, and we could tell that something's happening. And these are the 2 days, these are the months in that year when we were having most number of 95 plus days. 2020, what happened here? We squeezed rain in May and June. Didn't get much, right? But my yield in 2020 were better than 2019, right? And I'm also having higher number of days which are hotter in June. No rain, but my crop is not at that stage where it's very susceptible to water stress. We were receiving 7 inches of rain in July that year. So yes, we are having hot days, but we are also having some pretty good amount of rainfall that is compensating for some of the drought that we were experiencing. So so not only when are you getting hot days and the drought, but timing is also very important. And for this is 80% of the total ET that we applied for that 1 year, for these 2 years, 2018 and 2019. And if I did the math just when I was sitting there, this is 232 bushels on average. This is 210, and this is 174. That's the difference, over 60 bushel difference between 2 years, and almost normal rainfall. And ET has a lot to do with it. This is only 60% of the total ET for the lowest treatment, that is 450 gallons per minute. So overall, it's when we read manuscripts, people usually present irrigation plus rainfall, seasonal rainfall. But more important is the timing of the rainfall and what was coinciding weather-wise with the rainfall. If we are getting very hot days with those drought times and at the wrong time, wrong growth at the critical growth stage, we're going to see some differences in crop yield. And that's what was happening in 2022 as well, because some of those guys who were yielding 240 bushels, actually they planted late or something. I know one guy, he lost 6 cotton fields, planted his corn in June and missed July, the hottest time of the year. And his crop he was making about 240 bushels. And there was some who planted in May, as they usually do, and they were doing 94 bushels. It is important. Why it is important? I was talking to these guys from NOAA, and I was telling them, you guys need to pay attention to these things. You guys update 30. What we observe now, you guys update 30 days later. So we are already lagging. So they said they have this term called flash drought. There is no definition for it. Flash drought is just you get very hot and dry very quickly, but for a short duration. It was coined in 2013, and every person who has published paper has its own definition. And I could not find one single source. No, I could not find a subset which were doing same definitions. And NOAA is still debating. But then they came up with, some guy in University of Idaho came up with this concept called thirst waves. What is it? You pick a day, and then the evapotranspiration demand for that day, if that is more than 90th percentile, that is whatever your base data is, and this day is demanding more than the 90% of these base readings, you have a heat thirst wave. And if you have 3 of these consecutive days, You have to have 3 of these consecutive days. That's when you call it thirst wave. They published it. They published this data from, they used the base years 1981 to 2000, and they reported in this part over here, the intensity of these thirst waves is higher in this area. The duration is longer, and the frequency is also more frequent. So we are getting into these things that we probably will see some of these flash droughts. We probably will see some thirst waves. And we are already in drought right now for this region. So it becomes very more important. Like I said, I was a little nervous how to connect all these dots, and I'm still working on it. When the more I was working on it, the more question I was having. Um, so the take home so far I have is that we saw cotton, we saw soybean, we saw corn. I could not find data on sorghum. But different crop might be acting differently to individual stress, because one of the data that I showed with different well capacities, sorghum didn't care. It yielded 130 bushel every year. It does not care. We planted it late in June. Should have put that data in there. Keeping canopy cooler through transpiration is better, because what was happening when the droughts happen, people see their leaves are cooking, they start their irrigation on 24 hour circles. They're putting quarter-inch every day just to keep the plants sprinkled and cool. That doesn't help, because you want that water to go through the roots, because it will do the same thing for the plants as the sprinkling would, but for a longer period. And if it has moisture and it is getting hot, you want that plant to have access to that moisture, because it's not going to get 100 degrees at 10 a.m. in the morning. So you want to have that window for that plant to capture that sunlight and do some photosynthesis before it's going to start shutting down its stomata at 3 p.m. and lose those 3-4 hours of photosynthesis. And then adjusting irrigation depth. So I said the same thing. We did that presentation in 2023. And then limited irrigation capacities as we move forward probably will be the ones which are going to be a little affected. And like I said, I'm having more questions than I have take homes for this one, because there are the questions I have. I have these all 95 plus days stacked around these situations. But what's about the duration? How long these waves are going to affect it? What are the growth stages? Is planting date is going to affect it or not? And if I am going to reduce my population or something like that, is it going to have any effect on the sensible heat that you can sense, because you are letting more light penetrate to the soil and it's heating it up? So there are so many questions that we need to answer. And I'm still open for discussions and stuff and all the comments. But overall, this is what we have. So irrigation is important. Drought is going to, it's part of the ecosystem. It will happen, but watch out for the heat. Even if we are irrigating, watch out for the heat. Slow down, and then make sure that we have moisture condition, better moisture conditions to go with it, to compensate for the heat. And that's it. I'll be open for some questions if there are any comments. Yes.
So my question stands at, as for the last, say, probably 10 years, we were probably here, and there's a lady came from NASA and talked about our variability in, our weather patterns of changing going forward, right? And ever since, it's been pretty well true. So are we going to start looking at it as either state or university, how we can affect or alternatives to reducing water loss from plants as your ROS increases as your plant or your antioxidants go down? Is there any ways to start looking at like seaweed extracts, salicylic acid, jasmonic acid, silicones to start affecting some of these implications that we're having with these drought and heat tolerances?
The last part of your question, I didn't get it. Sorry.
So,
You said alternatives, yes.
say what?
You said alternatives, but I didn't get the last part of those assets you were talking about.
Well, so like when you start looking at your salicylic acids, your seaweed extracts, your silicones, all that stuff, applying it on certain plants and how they're positioned, right?
Yes.
Are we going to look into that and basically try to help the plant out, reduce the ROS that's production in the plant? I mean, at least going down the road.
We have not looked at those things yet. I have been approached, but yes, I mean, if there are options which work, we definitely will look into it. Yes. So far, we have not. Yeah. Only one product I tested was that I can't remember it was derived from corn. You're supposed to apply in furrow with planting, and it's supposed to help with retaining more moisture in the soil. I did it only 1 year, but it didn't yield any result.
All right. Any more questions for Dr. Sumit? All right. Hold on.
Did you look at how many 95 days plus also had high wind, because that could be
High what?
high wind,
Yes.
reducing the transpiration from the boundary layer?
Thank you. I forgot to mention that. Yes, one of the factors that we need to look into with these 95 plus days is wind, right? So, and I don't even know if 95 is the right number, because all these studies that I'm presenting are in the field. It's just observation. It's that I'm presenting right now. It's not the number, all right, this is the number that we need to look into. No, it's just an observation that we can relate for our observation in the field. Right? So yes, wind is something. So we will be working on, so I'm trying to put a project together and get about last 30 years of data, use this data that we have and simulate all these things with different scenarios. And that will include temperature, that will include irrigation, wind, all those things, and possibly planting data as well. One of the questions that I want to answer with this thing is that, all right, I am 2 out of 3 years that I presented, I had 80% of the ET was giving me as good of a yield statistically as 100% ET replacement, right? But there is 1 year when it tanks. How frequently that 1 year is going to happen? And if you look at the data from last 100 years on droughts, every 10 years you're looking at about 2 drought years. And so there is more analysis we're going to do. Hopefully in a year we will have data, or maybe in 2 years. But yes.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Let's give him a hand. All right. Our next speaker is a sub because his boss has a new bouncing baby boy. So Dr. Silva is on maternity leave about 2 weeks earlier than expected. But with that, we're happy to have Israel Cyrano. I can never know Cyrano. Say it. Cyrano?
Hello, Cyrano, but that's okay.
Going over the work, he's been a big part of this project with Dr. Silva, and I've heard him present it. He's talking about some of the stuff we're seeing that's probably not what we have been suggesting agronomically over the last 20 years.
Yeah, let's see. So, as Dr. Arnell already presented me, my name is Israel Cyrano. I am a PhD student here at the department. And let's say that my goal here is to make everybody stay awake because it's after lunch and usually I get a little sleepy. And I taught a class this semester and it's always funny to see students like fighting against their sleep. So I promise I will try to make everybody stay awake. So the topic of my presentation today is actually a question, which is, should we update our seeding rate recommendations for late planting? Because what we normally hear is if you're planting later, we should increase the seeding rate. But let's see if that's what we are actually observing in the field. So first, I wanted to say that I'm part of the small grains wheat team that's supervised by Amanda Silva. And in this team, we do applied research. So we have small plot trials and on-farm trials. And we also do outreach activities, such as the field days that if you participate in the field days, you probably saw Amanda talking about the which varieties we have there. So now, why are we studying delayed planting? So we know that climate change is threatening wheat production across the world because of weather pattern changes. Winters, they're getting warmer. Like next week will be Christmas and we'll be like in the 60s, 70s. So weather is definitely getting warmer. And not only the entire season during winter, but we're also seeing some weather pattern changes, especially during our planting period. So does anyone remember what happened in October of last year? Well, if you don't, let me recap for you here. We were in a severe drought. So here is the Oklahoma Drought Monitor, and all the red parts, it was like a severe, like extreme drought. And you saw like most of the states are even in drought conditions. And what we do, if we see this drought, we usually dust in our wheat, or we wait for the rains. But if these rains never come also, and do you remember what happened in the next month? So if you waited for some rain in October, you didn't dust in your wheat, you waited longer. What happened? No, sorry. There is this part here that I wanted also to highlight, that our September's and October rains, they are no longer reliable. We see a pattern change. So here's the deviation from the average rains for Chickasha. And we see for the past 5 years, we're actually in a deficit of our normal rains for September and October. And when it's not droughts, does anyone remember what happened then in November of last year? If you waited for your planting, if you were hoping for more rains, yeah, we had some floods. So if you see in some locations of Oklahoma, we got 5 to 6 inches of rain in just 3 days. And in some locations, we even saw like around 7 or almost 8 inches. So that's a lot of rain for us to receive in 3 days. And then once this rain comes, you need to wait for your fields to dry for you to be able to plant your wheat, causing a delay even further. So causing a delay in planting. That's why we want to study and understand what happens when you delay your planting. And not only because of weather, we're observing also an increase in interest of farmers to do double cropping on their land, especially like a rotation with wheat cotton, where the cotton harvest will be delaying wheat planting. So if you're interested in double cropping, you might have to delay your planting. And also, as Dr. Gavin was saying earlier, for weed management, that you want some weeds to emerge for you to control them to make your tillage. This is also a strategy. So you wait for some of these early fall emerging weeds to emerge, then you chew your ground, causing a delay for your wheat planting. And once this planting is delayed, we most likely will expect that yield will be decreased because of many reasons, such as temperatures will be cooler, so cooler temperatures for emergence, probably causing a reduction in your emergence. You'll have less tillering, less biomass, and overall leading to a decrease in yield. But is that what we will actually see if we conduct a study here in Oklahoma? Because there is no recent study confirming this hypothesis. And not only that, to see if yield actually decreases, but trying to understand better what causes this yield to decrease, or if not decreases, what is affecting the wheat. And what we often hear, as I said in the beginning, if you're late planting, what we normally do in our management is to increase the seeding rate. That's the most common practice we hear all over. I talked with a person yesterday on my posters that they were planting wheat, I think this week, and that's the common management is to increase the seeding rate. But wanted to understand if this is actually the case for Oklahoma. And the literature supports this information that low yielding environments, so environments with lower yield, such as we expect to see in delayed planting, requires a higher seed rate to compensate for this reduction in tillering, in emergence. So that's what we expect to see. Therefore, for us to test this hypothesis, we combined on-farm and small plot research with 3 objectives, which I like to see as 3 questions we want to answer. So the first question is, quantify yield responses to late planting relative to usual planting. So to see if late planting actually reduces yield and why it's reducing or why it's not. Our second question is to evaluate varieties differing in maturity patterns at late planting. So we have varieties that they're early maturing or late maturing and see how they respond to this late planting. And our third question we want to answer is to determine whether increasing seeding rate improves grain yield at late planting, to see if this common management practice is actually giving some results. This is the first trial we conducted here in Oklahoma. It was a small plot research, which we tested the combination of variety, seeding rate, and planting date. We had a total of 6 site years combination, so it's we conducted this trial in Oklahoma, so it's west of Enid, northwest Oklahoma, and in Stillwater. And we tested for 3 years, 2021, 2022, and 2023. We tested 2 seeding rates, the usual and the high. But one thing that I want to highlight first, look that we're using the seeding rates not in pounds per acres or bushel per acres, but we're using seeds per acres. And this is because the seed size varies a lot. So you have varieties that they have smaller seeds, varieties that they have bigger seeds. If you just set your seeding rate at 60 pounds, you have a wide range of populations you might be planting on your field. And this 87, it's our usual, which would be around 1 bushel for Gallagher. So you can consider that this is the 60 pounds per acre for Gallagher, but we're selecting this population, 870. And this high population would be like almost the double. So 1.75 in multiplication. We tested 8 full season varieties and 1 short season, which is Butler's Gold. I will explain in a moment what a short season variety is. And we tested 2 planting dates in this case, mid-October, which is the most common, the recommended, and also early December, so it's very late, after Thanksgiving. And here's how the plots they looked. We have here the mid-October planting right next to the early December planting. The picture was taken, I think it was like May 20th, something like that. So as I was going to explain the difference between short season and full season genotypes. So a full season genotype, full season variety would be a regular system like what we commonly do here in the state, where our planting is around mid-September if you're looking for dual purpose, or mid-October if you're looking for grain only. Your cycle is between 9 and 10 months, and you harvest in June. Now, a short season variety would be focused for a grain-only system, where your planting would be around late November and early December. Your cycle would be much shorter. Instead of 9 to 10 months, would be only 7 months cycle. And you're still able to maintain your same harvest date. So around June, you'll be able to harvest your wheat and follow for your next crop if we're doing a double cropping. So now going here to some of our results. First, we have here the late planting effect on yield. So here, each box is for a specific site here. And as we first see here, there is not much of a pattern. Each year responded different. Some years yield actually decreased for after Thanksgiving planting, but some years yield actually increased for late planting. And that was something that we did not expect first in our hypothesis, as we expected that yield would always decrease. But we saw that depending on the year, how what we saw in the field, in the weather, our response changes. So we observed that for some site years that when late planting was able to accumulate a lot of biomass, it had like a good weather, good rains. That was one of the reasons that was able to have a higher yield for late planting. So like here in Stillwater 21, our mid-October planting, we had a nice storm here that formed a crust in the soil. So this reduced our stand for Stillwater 21, while our after Thanksgiving planting didn't see these negative effects. So that's one of the reasons that explain this higher yield. But overall, we want to keep in mind that it's not always that we'll see a higher yield if you plant in October, that how your weather is very dependent on your response. Now, the second thing we observed regarding the varieties was that we almost didn't see any yield difference between all the varieties we tested at late planting. The only difference we saw was between Butler's Gold, which is the short season, and Bob Doe. And we believe is that because Bob Doe was able to produce a lot of biomass, explaining this slightly higher yield. But when we look at the crop cycle, how long the crop took from sowing to jointing to anthesis, and anthesis to maturity, Butler's Gold, on average of the 6 site years, was able to achieve physiological maturity, which is around 5 to 7 days before the actual maturity for harvest, 5 days earlier than the full season genotypes. And this is on average. So it means for some site years, this difference was even larger. Instead of just 5 days, this difference was 7 or even 10 days earlier than the other varieties. And we believe this variety is able to reach this faster maturity because it has earlier jointing, so it joints 5 days earlier. It reaches first hollow stem earlier also and has an earlier anthesis. And these 5 days, it seems not so much, but it's already a difference if you're double cropping on your farm. If you want to harvest your crop as soon as possible, putting your next crop on the ground as fast, and then maybe it's a rain window that you might miss if you put a full season genotype on your field. So this is a good management. So this would be like an interesting management practice if you're looking for anticipated maturity. Now, which is here the part that is the title of our presentation, talking about the seeding rate effect on yield. And what we first observed is that if you late plant here after Thanksgiving, we didn't observe any difference, even if you put more seeds in there. So if you have your regular management, which is 870, it will yield the same if you put your 1.4 million seeds per acre. So what we're observing is that there is no need for you to put more seeds if you're planting later. You can keep your regular practice. So no difference in yield. But why is that? What we're observing is if you put more seeds, your field, you may see more heads on your field. It will look that chiller more, it has more biomass. And we see that when you put more seeds, there is an increase in heads per area, in number of heads. But what we also see happening is a reduction in grain number per heads. So you see more heads on your field with a higher seeding rate, but your heads, they're smaller. So that's why we don't see any difference in yield. So more heads, but with less grains per head. And now we're we'll be talking about an on-farm research we did in Miami, so Northwest Oklahoma, where instead of the small plots, like I showed the picture, like they're tiny, we did this in a farm field. So the trial in total, so the trial was like 1,500 feet by 720 feet, which in total, the trial size was around 25 acres. So it's a big trial. And we conducted the trial in 2024. We also conducted this year, but we're yet to analyze this year's data. We had 2 different varieties, high cotton and Butler's Gold, and we tested 5 seeding rates. So 500, 700, 900, 1.1, and 1.3. I want to highlight 900 is the usual practice. And we had, instead of 2, 3 planting dates, mid-October, early November, and early December, or after Thanksgiving. The first thing I want to share is that the highest yielding planting date wasn't mid-October as we normally do for this case. It was early November was the highest yielding, but it didn't differ from mid-October. And then after Thanksgiving, which is the late planting, caused a yield reduction. But it's still, we didn't see statistically difference from planting after Thanksgiving from mid-October. So I know we see some different numbers here, like 63 to 47. It seems like a big difference, but when we look statistically, they are the same because of the data variation we have. But one thing interesting now is when we look at the varieties, how they are adapted to these planting dates, we see a different response. So first, in mid-October, you see that high cotton was the highest yielder because it's a variety adapted for planting around mid-October. In early November, we didn't see a difference between these varieties. And then when you plant after Thanksgiving, you see that Butler's Gold was the top yielder variety, as it was adapted to late planting environment. So for this case, we saw that variety played a critical role in determining yield depending on your planting date. So if you're planting later, Butler's Gold for this scenario was the top yielder variety. And here is the seeding rate response based on planting dates. And what we see here, so if you plant after Thanksgiving, your highest yield is still on the 900 group. So we are still able to achieve our high yield, maintaining the same management practice we normally do in October. Now, this is a broader perspective of what we were trying to visualize, because we saw here in Oklahoma, we don't need to increase our seeding rate when we're planting later. But we wanted to see if this is just for Oklahoma or if it's also a worldwide trend of what we're observing. Therefore, we did a synthesis analysis where we collected information from published papers around the world, and we were able to find 22 papers that they evaluated planting date and seeding rate, all for winter wheat. So you see here in places here in the United States, some in Canada, in Europe, in China. And what we observed when analyzing this data set is that in most locations, in 66% of these locations, they don't actually need to increase their seeding rate more than what they actually do when they're late planting. So it's a similar response to what we see here. If in most locations, if they're late planting, they can keep their current recommendation. So we're trying to understand why is that? Because, as I said in the beginning, environments with lower yield, they do need to increase their seeding rate. And what we observed also, here's trying to find the seeding rate to optimize yield depending on planting delay And here, when delays are from 10 to 30 days or more than 30 days, we do see an increase in the seeding rate required to maximize yield. But why we don't see this need to increase based on our recommendations? So that's the next question we're trying to answer. So why don't we need to increase the seeding rate for late planting? Because we know that late planting still reduces tillering and biomass production. And our usual rate is already enough to maximize yield at late planting. So why we're observing what we're observing? So does this mean that our current seeding rate recommendations for usual planting, they're a bit high? Maybe. So that's where we're looking now. We did also other on-farm research in Garber. So it's east of Enid by I-35. And this is just a preliminary data. Also, it's just one site here. So we're still trying to figure out and make sure this response repeats in other years. Where we had 2 varieties, high cotton and Butler's Gold, and 5 seeding rates. So 700, 900, 1.1, 1.3, 1.5. And the trial size in total was around 30 acres. So it was also a large trial. And what we observe on our seeding rate response is that we can lower our seeding rate to 700, and we still don't observe a yield difference from the 700 to 900. And I want to highlight here was October planted. So I'm not talking about late planting. This is for regular planting, trying to understand our current seeding rate recommendations for October. And it makes sense that Butler's Gold reached a lower yield, similar to what we observed for Miami data. But maybe our seeding rate recommendations for October, they're a little bit high. That's why we don't need to increase our seeding rates for December. Therefore, showing all this fun data, my takeaway message for you all today is that planting winter wheat in Oklahoma showed no consistent yield loss. It was very dependent on weather, how weather performed on each year. Short season variety didn't outperform the other ones in most locations on yield, but certainly has a role in crop diversification because it's able to reach this maturity faster, earlier, on average 5 days, but some years there were more than that. And also has good end-use quality. I didn't mention here in this presentation, but Butler's Gold was also able to have bigger kernels, bigger grains. So it's very good for quality. And my last message, which I believe is the most important for today that I wanted to share with you, is that we don't need to increase our seeding rate when we're late planting. And I know this goes the other way from what we normally hear and do, but our data is showing that there is no need for it to increase the seeding rate. Well, I just wanted to acknowledge my advisor, Amanda, the Small Greens Wheat team for helping me to conduct this research. And also, we'd like to thank Oklahoma Wheat Commission for partially funding this research. Thank you.
Questions for Israel?
If I'm going to expect other varieties to well, first, thank you for your question. The question is if you're intending to conduct this research on farm trials with other varieties. And for now, our plans is to keep only for these 2 varieties. But we know that Dr. Carver, the OSU breeder, his team is also breeding for new varieties also adapted to late planting. So we might include those in these trials in the future. Thank you.
Mike, I would just add to that is that none of this data is really surprising. We got Jeff right in here. Is seed man in here? Okay. So Jeff's been taking Brett's seed for a very long time now and putting it as low as what I would say is 15 pounds per acre. The foundation seed's done a really good job of figuring out how little bit of seed they need to get to full. And what you guys, Matt, you guys are 50 pounds per acre is not a problem, right? Yeah. That 700,000 is probably like a 48 pound, 50. I think we've just been put way too much seed in the ground for a long time, regardless of variety.
Any other questions? Uh,
Could you quickly go over the fertility program?
the fertility, the management we did here was the usual practice. It was during planting, and we did an top dress nitrogen application also.
If you look, so Simpson Abiola, the second place poster is this work with nitrogen. Delayed nitrogen had no impact. So late, only nitrogen really late in the spring. Seeding rate didn't matter either. All right, let's think Israel.
Thank you.
All right, as Dave's bringing up his desk because he likes going up and down. Anyway, so the last speaker of this session before we get into the roundtable session is Dr. Radon Sherry. I'd like to introduce him, though, as instead of the postdoc, he is, when is it official?
Monday's my first day.
Monday is his first day as the new Southwest area agronomist. And so he'll be trying to help represent Southwest Oklahoma. But today's topic is going to be double crop corn nitrogen management.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is this good on the mic? Okay. How about that? All right. So talking about a little bit double crop corn, also kind of synonymously late planted corn. And so really talking about moving that planting date into late June, early July, how we are going to manage that corn as best as we can with some of the issues that go along with it. And then depending on the time, and if I run out of time, just throw something at me. We've got some other data here on full season corn work too that we've been working on for a while. So the first thing, kind of first decision that we have to make, what hybrid are we going to plant? Especially the big question we need to ask is what maturity are we putting in that field, in that system? Again, late June, early July. And I think it's been, what, 4 or 5 years ago, Josh, that you gave this talk over there at the Union in winter crops. And the question was asked, okay, what are your opinions on relative maturity of your corn in a double crop system or a late planted system? And there was lots of different answers. But what we got to keep in mind is what we're really trying to do, this work, there we go, is match up with those critical growth periods with the best opportunity to alleviate some of the heat stress, drought, things like that, that Sumit talked about a little bit. We all know it's hot and dry in August, early September. It's going to be a problem. How do we avoid that the best we can with our hybrid selection? And so first thing is making sure we're shifting as much as we can those key periods. So anthesis through grain fill into the coolest part of that time, of the time frame we have as possible, as much as we can, and hopefully catching some of that consistent or more consistent rainfall that we hope to get in September, especially. Of course, double crop corn it has inherent risk compared to sorghum, compared to maybe soybeans. Double crop corn, it's more as far as it's harder to grow corn when it's hot, when it's dry. It has more potential to decrease yields in some of those conditions compared to some of the other crops, and those be more detrimental. And it's important to remember that our growth is going to be much different than what you may be used to in an early planted corn system. Remember that when we talk about late planted corn, we're putting that corn crop into the hottest part of the year. That means we're going to accumulate GDDs. We're going to accumulate those heat units much more rapidly. We're going to change the morphological kind of calendar of that plant to an extent because we're growing so much quicker compared to a crop that's been planted in late March, early April in the downstate area. So looking at double crop corn, expect a shorter crop, lower leaves. I know a lot of times our double crop corn this year, we had lots of ears that were maybe a foot off the ground. It's just something we got to deal with. slow the combine down. It's just kind of part of the deal. But it's just something to keep in mind that it is going to be a different crop than your full season corn planted in the early part of the year. So hybrid selection, kind of focus in on that. If we look at this little table here, on the left side, you see kind of when you're going to hit those key growth stages based on planting date with a 119-day hybrid. And on the right, when you're going to hit key days with a 90-day hybrid. So again, April 1, kind of our target early planting season. We're hitting maturity, R6, about June 28th. Moving down to June 15th, so that, right after we might get that wheat crop out, especially in the southern half of the state, we plant that 119-day hybrid, probably hitting about September 3rd is when we're hitting R6. Move over to a 90-day hybrid, and we're now hitting R6 at August 7th. So we're getting maturity, or going through anthesis, going through grain fill in late July, early August, the worst part of the year to be doing that. And then, of course, we move into July 15th a little bit later. If we plant that 119-day corn, we're finishing out about October 10th at Dent at R5. And then if we move to a 90-day hybrid, we finish out about September 15th. So again, if you think about that, if we're moving that anthesis to grain fill, we got to make sure we're moving it as late as possible to the point we can still finish that crop. And that's so when you hear Josh talk about double crop corn a lot, don't change maturities. If you plant 118-day corn in April, plant 118-day corn in the 1st of July. Avoid that mid-season heat that we get hammered with so much every year, year in and year out. Moving to plant populations, this is some data that he has, Josh has from Perkins, Bixby, EFAL here in Stillwater. And the first thing right here, you can see this nice curve. I put up some indicators. He had the yield in pounds per acre, but you can see at 7,000 it's 130 bushel, 4,000 about 75 bushel. But you can see plant population moving across the rates. 8,000, we're about 73% of top end yield, about 75 bushel. Move on through up to 18,000 plant population, maxing out about 138 bushel. And then we see that yield curve begin to drop off from that increased plant population in a double crop system. And these are dry land fields for the most part, I believe, at least as far as EFAL here in Stillwater and Perkins. A little bit more expanded data on some of this kind of same work, same locations. You have plant population across the x-axis. Each one of these color bars are grouped. You can see pounds of nitrogen per acre, doing a little fertility work involved in this study. And if you look at these, kind of the same curve, going up to that 17,900 plants per acre, kind of the same story. If you look at the fertility, you begin to see this as far as 100 pounds. We maximize yield effectively at that top plant population at 75 pounds per bin per acre, which we'll dive in a little bit more into some fertility management here later. But just kind of preface that, there is a little numerical bump in some of those bars, but that's not statistically significant. So again, maxing out yield about 75 pounds at that population. Moving on, just to compare effectively plant population and then yield per 1,000 plants. So again, now we're looking at full season and double crop. The blue bar represents plant population as far as how much yield is per 1,000 plants across that scale. And then orange line is revenue, which is effectively seed costs, or not seed costs, but the amount of yield per unit at each one of those plant populations. And you can see for full season and double crop, once we get past the 18,000 mark, the revenue begins to kind of cave off. We do maximize that yield per plant effectively, that yield per small area at the lowest rate, which we kind of expect that. We kind of talk about, how much room does that plant have to thrive? That's going to pull on more yield components, but there is a cutoff and there's a threshold where we have to make sure we're putting enough plants in the field that we're supporting yields, that we're going to have our best opportunity to make a little bit of money. Same thing over there on the double crop though, moving over to the full season double crop. We just have that curve again peaking up about 18,000 plant population before we see revenue cave off. And then you're also following the downslope as far as the amount of yield per 1,000 plant population. And what that kind of brings us back to, if you kind of think about physiologically, is what we're really talking about. If you think about wheat, is how many spikes are in an area, how many grains are in a spike, and how many total spikes are in the field, effectively yield components. This is from a paper from Spain talking about wheat. Unfortunately, I didn't have one for corn, but how many grains are in an area in the field. And that's what really that is what's driving yield. You throw in some weight as far as kernel weight and things like that, and that's what really matters. So again, we have some flex in hybrids in our corn. Yes, if you plant 12,000 seeds per acre, you get down to 12,000 plants per acre, I should say. Yes, you're probably going to see bigger ears. You're going to see more kernels per ear. But at what point do we hit that critical line where we're dropping our rates too low? And a lot of this data shows about 18,000. Also, something to keep in mind, when we talk about double crop corn, we're planting in very different conditions compared to our full season systems, or our early season systems, I should say. You look at this chart on the left, we have percent germination across seeding rate for full season corn, or early season corn, right? 88 to 91% germination. So just call it 90%. If we move over to double crop there on the right, this drops to about 75 to 79% germination. So even though we may be pulling back as far as our plant population, keep in mind that we are probably going to have less germination, just a little bit, about 10% or so. You might need to pump those seeds per acre up a little bit to get that plant population that you're targeting on a specific farm. All right. Are there any questions about any of that before I move on? Yes, sir. So this is for this right here. So this stuff is Perkins, and here Stillwater. Those are both dry land. Was Bixby irrigated at all? They're all three dry land. And what about the germination data and stuff? All local? Okay, everything was dry land. Yeah, so keep that in mind. If you are in an irrigated system, it could push things a little bit. And we'll get into some irrigated stuff here in a little bit too. Oh, too far. Yep. This data was mostly before, correct, for the most part? That has all the things pertaining to like every plant, and it yielded nearly 150 bushels. So it really just depends on your input base level and how much the seed is out there. Any more questions? What I just showed, it's been, yeah, from about 2 years ago, going back. All right, anything else before I move on? All right, I don't think it'd be a winter crops school without seeing the ladder at least once, as everybody knows. And really the reason I made sure and put the ladder in is really important is sometimes we get a little bit ahead of ourselves. Double crop corn at the end of the day is still the same soil fertility fundamentals. We still need to make sure we're basing our recommendations, our applications on soil tests. We need to make sure we're working up the ladder, soil pH, P and K, nitrogen, before we start talking about secondaries and micros, because the further up we go, the more issues maybe we can take care of as we move up the ladder, especially when we're talking about soil pH and phosphorus, potassium. So just keep that in mind. It's still the same fundamentals, regardless of the season. So hopefully everybody got a chance to talk to Miss Emily Staten here. This is some of her work from her master's thesis, looking at double crop corn nitrogen. We had a little bit different. It wasn't a plant population and nitrogen study like Josh had. This is just looking at nitrogen rates across several sites in Oklahoma. And you can see this graph. This is from all of her data combined, 2024 and 2025, with 8 sites. One of those was irrigated. One was limited irrigated, I would say, and then 6 dry land sites. And what you can see is this graph is awful. There's no meaningful information really on there. It's scattered everywhere. It is what it is. But we'll come back to this here in a little bit, and we're going to break some of this out a little bit site by site, and then we'll kind of come back to this. So just 3 sites from 2025. And if you look through all this data, a lot of it has the same message at the end of the day. And if you look at all 3 of these sites, so Fort Cobb was our irrigated site as far as full irrigation. And you can see yield in the blue bars, profit, which would just be a partial budget as far as how much yield did you get minus the nitrogen cost. So a partial budget following that orange line. But if you look at the nitrogen rates, we go across there on each one of these sites, regardless if we're talking about Fort Cobb that's irrigated, Perkins, which is a dryland sandy soil, and then Perry, this is a dryland site as well. Once we get to about 60 pounds of nitrogen, we don't really see any benefit from additional nitrogen over that level. And you can see that especially whenever you start talking about that marginal revenue that you're gaining or losing past that point where you're not getting any return to that additional investment to nitrogen. And so this kind of goes back to some of Josh's data. He didn't have as many rates, but I bet you if you put something around the 60-pound mark, you'd probably see about the same yields as that 75, 100, 150 marks that he had in his graphs as well. So combining all that data together from 2025, this is 6 sites, so 4 dryland, 1 irrigated, 1 limited irrigated. Top left, you can just see yield. And there is some variability that you can't really tell in this data set, just the way I have it presented. But effectively, site to site across the study, 60 pounds of nitrogen in double crop corn, maximized yield. It didn't matter if we were talking about 110 bushel corn at Fort Cobb or 60 bushel corn here in Stillwater, 60 pounds of nitrogen did it. And then you can see it again, just another breakout as far as the partial budget for that nitrogen. Again, about 60 pounds, that's where we're going to make the most money, get the most bang for our buck for what nitrogen we are going to apply in that system. Moving back to this, and again, I said this graph is ugly. It's not very useful, but there is kind of one thing interesting. If you look at the orange dotted line, that is just the average mean yield across all those sites. And it just so happens to be right at 60 bushel. So again, if we're talking about 1 pound in, one pound, 1.1, 1.2 pounds of in per bushel as far as a requirement to produce that grain, and we're getting 60 bushel average, and the data shows that 60 pounds of ends are optimum, well, this kind of makes a little bit of sense. Yes, we do have some sites and some opportunities where we push over 100 bushels in this data set. But still, at the end of the day, 60 pounds of in on average got us to where we needed to be across those 8 sites. Now, I'm not saying that fits across every field. I know there's some fields in southwest Oklahoma that are under good water that can push 200 bushel double crop or late planted corn at least. So keep that in mind in the environments that we're trying to do this in. And there are some caveats about our irrigated site that I will bring up in a little bit. But again, if we're talking about downstate double crop dryland corn, 75 pounds, 60 pounds, probably consciously all you want to probably put up, especially if you're relying on an upfront application or something like that. Moving on, other management decisions. It's incredibly important, I think, to rely on a good residual program. Start clean, stay clean. Remember that crop is going to be so much more compressed as far as that growing season. You don't have as many days to hit your stages. So you walk out one day, you're at V5. Next day, next week, you're at V7, V8. So keep that in mind that you have to stay ahead of the curve when we're talking about double crop corn or late planted corn, that you don't have as many actual days before you hit those stages, especially early in the season, that you may need to keep in mind as far as your over-the-top herbicides. Plant back intervals. Most of our group 2s are not good on corn. I'm sure most of you realize that. But if you have double stop in the field, you spray beyond in March, that's 8.5 months back before you can plant corn. Keep that in mind. Glean, classic, finesse. Finesse I think is 18 months back to corn. Keep that in mind when you're making that plan to go back to double crop corn at some point, that we need to keep in mind those herbicide plans, make sure we're not going to put ourselves in a bind put money into a crop that's never even going to get out of the ground or going to look awful when it does. Disease, and this kind of one of the big things. Keep in mind that the diseases that we have maybe in full season or early planted corn, which I would say is not really a whole lot compared to some of our neighbors to the southeast or some in the Midwest. When we move that season later in the year, hotter, sometimes we get a little bit wet, we have humidity. There could be very, very different disease situations going on in that field compared to what we're used to in an early planted system. One great example this year was southern rust. I think 4 of the 5 sites or 6 sites that we had this year had a heavy southern rust infestation. I believe that's what caused it at Fort Cobb, that little bit maybe reduced yield level compared to maybe what we hoped for. But this is an example of one plant there at Fort Cobb Research Station. You can see it's just the whole field. We had to take some plant samples that day that picture was taken, and we looked like Cheetos coming out. Okay, so again, something that you may not worry about because you're already past the point in your early season. Keep in mind in that double crop or late planted system. Insects. I'm glad Dr. Ferris is still here. Pest pressure is probably a little different. We keep talking about leaf hoppers. I'm sure there's other stuff too. I'm not an entomologist. But again, keep in mind the different pests that may be out there. Scout. Talk to your state specialists, things like that. Whatever you need to do to take care of those issues, make sure they don't become a problem for yourself or your growers. All right, what am I doing on time? It's pretty quick. All right. So shifting gears, now we're talking about full season corn only as far as this data set. And this is some very new work that we're doing. Mr. Nick Matthew here, this is some of his master's work, and this is a large multi-state project that we've gotten to be a part of. And I gave this part of this talk, this little section down at Mississippi State at their winter CCA meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I sat in my hotel room and Brian came up with this title, Value of Sulfur in Corn Production. And I decided really that wasn't a very good title. And so last second I said, do we actually know anything about nitrogen and sulfur? That's right. No, we don't have a clue. So here's some of the objectives that Dr. Arnell kind of posed. When we add sulfur to the system, how does it impact the nitrogen curve or that nitrogen response curve in corn? If it does impact it, how does it impact it? Does it shift that curve up? Does it shift it out? Does it change the economic optimum? Does it stabilize the back end of that yield curve? If you look back at some older data, this is a nitrogen and irrigation study out in the Panhandle. If you look at those points really closely, you can see that yields are beginning to drop off at high nitrogen rates. Is sulfur maybe the key to fixing this quadratic curve issue that we're running into, where we're actually losing yield by applying too much nitrogen? So again, just trying to dig, poke around, throw something at the wall and see what's going on. So jumping into some data just real quick, I'm going to talk about our Oklahoma data. If you look at the x-axis on these are all nitrogen rate based on yield goal. 150 bushel yield goal here at the Perry site, so 100% is 150 pounds in, just to make it simple. The orange lines are with sulfur. The blue lines are with no sulfur. You look at Perry, there's no statistical difference here, but you do see a little bit of a separation between those curves. No statistics, it's 1 year data. Didn't want to get too deep. But you see maybe a curve that it suggests that sulfur may give us a little bit of benefit. If you move over to Goodwell, 225 pounds of nitrogen at the 100 pound rate or the 100% rate. It's kind of different. We see with sulfur, we start very low. We see that quadratic curve that we're trying to avoid with sulfur. And then our no sulfur treatments almost looks like we didn't even top out yield. All right. Moving down to Fort Cobb. This is a fully irrigated site. 2 curves. We get that nice quadratic curve from our no sulfur treatment. It looks like we almost plateau and stabilize with the addition of sulfur at Fort Cobb. And if you notice these 2 sites, the Goodwell and Fort Cobb, almost have inverse behavior compared to each other. So what maybe is causing some of those things? Of course, we haven't got to dig into a whole lot of extra stuff, but just some ideas. Could it be just that we had some weird yield levels? We had a pretty good yield at Fort Cobb. Yields were depressed out in the Panhandle. Could that maybe be doing something? What about soil texture? Fort Cobb's a deep, dunal, fine, sandy loam. Goodwell's a clay loam. It's thick, it's nasty. Fort Cobb, no organic matter. Very, very different environments. Could that be part of what's driving those differences? Moving over to some of our dryland sites, again, the same setup as far as these graphs. Ponca City, we ran out of nitrogen. We're almost certain of it. You can see deficiency in the field, but the curves are almost identical all the way up. And the same thing with Perkins here, where we top out about 140 bushel an acre. With and without sulfur did not matter. No difference, no trend difference, nothing we can talk about. The one site that we did see a significant difference, I believe, was the Bixby location. This was planted a little bit later, but you can see as we move out past that curve, past that 50% mark, that curve begins to separate between each other. And there was a benefit of sulfur, I believe, at the 75 or 65% nitrogen rate. So, out of all our data, really about one site at one point, we maybe saw a sulfur response. Tillage, Bixby's a heavily tilled system. The alluvial, it's kind of powdered up every year compared to Perkins and Ponca City. No till environment. Is it organic matter? Is it texture? Again, we don't really know. We're just now starting to dig into this. A little bit of data from Mississippi. One site, again, sulfur. We start off a little bit higher, but then that net nitrogen rate curve without sulfur continues to go up, exceeding with sulfur treatments. What about that good dirt? That expensive stuff? This is some data from Jake Voss and Kemper up at Twin State Inc. Liquid Grow, one site in Roseville, Illinois, one site in Tipton, Iowa. Sulfur doesn't matter. At either one of those sites, there's no statistical difference. And that's with at 0 pounds of sulfur, 20 pounds of sulfur, or 40 pounds of sulfur. Okay? Same story. So I just want to jump through this real quick, but there's one paper out there from Minnesota that kind of does the same style of study that we talked about. And they have 3 statements in the discussion that I think are important. One, when N is applied at rates below which maximize grain yield, the benefits of S fertilization are not fully realized in corn grain yield. If you go back to our graphs from Oklahoma, I don't think that's true. 3 of our 6 sites or 5 sites or whatever it was, the biggest gap between the sulfur and no sulfur was at a 0 nitrogen rate. Okay, so there's questions there. Moving down to the bottom of that statement, but due to the greater N requirement of corn, the influence that the N has on S uptake may be greater than that S has on N uptake. We need more nitrogen. It's going to affect sulfur uptake more than sulfur uptake is going to affect nitrogen uptake. That's their findings. And finally, maybe even more concerning, if you think about what Brian talked about for 10 years, especially in wheat, over and over again, we've talked about, can we get a sulfur response in wheat? There's been a few times that we said no, but not only did we say no, we said we lost yield because we added sulfur. Okay, and it goes, but this makes me wonder why, if maybe this is connected to it. When S is applied above nutritional needs, sulfate may accumulate in the basal stalk and reduce the amount of nitrate accumulating therein. If we're reducing the amount of nitrate in the stalk at the time of year, whenever you're using that measurement to get an idea of where we're at with nitrogen status, are we causing a reduction in the amount of nitrate that we're putting into grain fill and causing losses in yield possibly? Just something to think about. Real quick, just a list of our collaborators on this N by S study, also our supporters at Nutrient and Fertilizer Institute and Tessendero Curley. We couldn't do this work without them as far as the N by S work. With that, if you have any qualms, send the mob at those 2. Their names on there, their emails on there. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk today. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them if I got any time.
Questions for Dr. Sherry?
Do what? My office will be at Chickasha at the research station. Yeah, come bother me if you want to.
Yeah. Have you guys ever done any corn, what I call corn on corn, same year? It obviously had to be pretty far south. I didn't know if you'd ever messed around, did any research on that.
Are you saying corn on corn within the same year?
Yes, sir.
Matter of fact, we have not. That is something that I would like to personally mess around with. But we haven't done that. Kind of talking about that Rio Grande Valley kind of system. We haven't done that yet. Josh is he's pushed against me on it for about 4 years now, and I'm gonna win eventually.
Yeah.
I'll outlast him.
Yeah. I missed what he said.
Go ahead, put it.
Yeah. Pretty tight. What kind of maturity are you planting on the first set? Okay. And then the second? Okay. Well, so one of my ideas is to try to run like a 70-day hybrid up front and then get a double crop in by July. This is not a recommendation.
No, it's not. This is not OSU supported recommendation.